Ethan Calloway leaned back in the leather chair of his private study, the weight of silence pressing down on him. The towering glass windows of the mansion framed the city skyline, a glittering reminder of his success. At 42, Ethan was at the pinnacle of his career, the CEO of a global tech empire that bore his name. Yet tonight, as the world beyond his walls buzzed with life, Ethan felt an emptiness no accolade could fill. The mansion was too quiet, its vast hallways echoing his footsteps. Vanessa was out again, hosting a gala for one of the countless charities she patronized. He admired her for it. She thrived in the limelight, effortlessly commanding attention with her charm and elegance. But lately, her public persona seemed to overshadow the person she was behind closed doors. He couldn't remember the last time they'd had a conversation that didn't feel like a business negotiation or a polite exchange between strangers. The thought unsettled him, and he pushed it away. He turned his attention to the photo on his desk, Vanessa in a brilliant ivory gown on their wedding day, her radiant smile promising a future full of possibilities. Back then, they'd both believed in a vision of a life together. Somewhere along the way, their dreams had diverged. When Vanessa finally returned that evening, Ethan was waiting for her in the sitting room. She swept in, carrying an air of accomplishment that was almost tangible. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, her designer perfume lingering as she settled into a chair across from him. "How was the gala?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Wonderful," she replied, her smile as polished as ever. "We raised nearly $500,000. The press was thrilled. They said it was the event of the season." Ethan nodded. "That's great. You do amazing work." Her eyes flickered briefly to his, and for a moment, he thought she might say something meaningful. Instead, she reached for the crystal decanter on the table and poured herself a drink. "You should have come. People kept asking about you." "I've been busy," he said, his voice tight. He hesitated before continuing. "Vanessa, I've been thinking about us. About what we want." Her hand froze midair, the glass poised just below her lips. "What we want," she repeated, her tone cautious. "I want a family," he said, the words spilling out more urgently than he'd intended. "I want this house to feel alive. I want to share our lives with someone who'll carry our legacy forward. I thought we always wanted that." Vanessa set the glass down, her expression cooling. "Ethan, we've talked about this. I love our life the way it is. A child would change everything." "That's the point," he replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Change isn't always bad, Vanessa. Don't you ever feel like something's missing?" "No," she said firmly, crossing her arms. "I don't. And I don't understand why you do. We have everything, Ethan. A beautiful home, successful careers, the freedom to do whatever we want. Why would you want to complicate that?" "Because everything doesn't feel like enough anymore," he said quietly. The argument stretched on, each of them retreating further into their opposing views. By the time Vanessa stormed off to their bedroom, Ethan was left with the same aching loneliness he'd started the evening with. The following week, Ethan attended an orphanage fundraiser hosted by one of his company's philanthropic initiatives. It was the kind of event he usually delegated to his team, but tonight, he needed the distraction. The ballroom was packed with donors and socialites, their conversations blending into a murmur of polite laughter and clinking glasses. He wandered to a quieter corner of the event, where a series of photographs showcased children from the orphanage. Most of them were smiling, their faces full of hope, but one picture caught his attention. It was of a baby girl, no older than 6 months, her wide eyes staring directly at the camera as though she could see through the lens. The caption below the photo read, "Nora, 6 months. In need of a forever home." Ethan's chest tightened. He read the caption again, then turned to the volunteer standing nearby. "Tell me about her," he said. The volunteer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, explained that Nora had been left at the orphanage shortly after birth. She'd been born prematurely and had faced health challenges, but she was a fighter. "She's a special little girl," the woman said. "A family could change her life." The words lingered with Ethan long after the event ended. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about Nora. Something about her had stirred a part of him he'd almost given up on, the part that believed in second chances, in building something real. Over the next few days, Ethan made discreet inquiries. His wealth and influence expedited the adoption process, though he insisted on following every step by the book. He visited the orphanage in person, holding Nora for the first time in a quiet room filled with sunlight. She was so small, so fragile, yet when her tiny fingers curled around his, Ethan felt an unshakable resolve take root. He didn't tell Vanessa. He knew she'd never agree. But he also knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. For once in his life, he was willing to take a risk that wasn't calculated or strategic. It was purely from the heart. Ethan hadn't known what to expect when he arrived at the orphanage for the final time, but the moment they placed baby Nora in his arms, the enormity of the decision hit him. She blinked up at him with curious eyes, her tiny fingers brushing against his collar. The quiet weight of her presence in his arms was unlike anything he'd ever felt. For a man used to orchestrating billion-dollar deals with confidence, Ethan suddenly felt small in the face of this fragile life. Over the next few days, he spent hours with Nora, learning her routines, her needs, her quiet moments of wonder. The adoption process, expedited by his resources, had been a whirlwind, but holding her grounded him in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd never spent so much time away from work, and for once, he didn't miss the constant barrage of emails or meetings. Instead, he found himself marveling at the little things, her yawn, the way she gripped his finger, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing when she slept. But even as he bonded with Nora, a quiet unease lingered. Vanessa had no idea. He'd spent the past week carefully constructing excuses for his absence, unexpected business in another city, a critical meeting that couldn't wait. Each lie tightened the knot of guilt in his chest, but every time he looked at Nora, he reminded himself that some risks were worth taking. Back home, Vanessa had noticed Ethan's growing distance. She'd grown accustomed to his long work hours and frequent travel, but this time felt different. He hadn't even called to check in about the upcoming charity dinner she was hosting. She brushed it off at first, assuming he was just wrapped up in another project, but the thought lingered. One evening, over cocktails with her best friend Charlotte, she voiced her frustration. "I don't know what's gotten into him lately," Vanessa said, swirling her glass of wine. "It's like he's avoiding me." Charlotte, who had known Vanessa since their early modeling days, leaned back in her chair with a knowing look. "Maybe he's finally fed up with you dragging him to all these galas," she teased. Vanessa forced a laugh, but the joke didn't land. "It's not that," she said, her voice quieter now. "Something feels different. Like he's keeping something from me." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Have you two talked about it?" Vanessa hesitated. "Not really. We've barely talked at all lately. Every time we do, it's the same argument about children. He's so obsessed with the idea of a family, but I don't understand why he can't see how perfect our life already is." Charlotte tilted her head, studying her friend. "Maybe he's not looking for perfection. Maybe he's looking for something real." Vanessa frowned, bristling at the suggestion. "Are you saying our life isn't real?" "I'm saying," Charlotte replied carefully, "that sometimes people want more than what's on the surface. And maybe you should ask yourself why the idea of a family scares you so much." The words lingered long after Charlotte had left. That night, as Vanessa walked through the cavernous halls of their home, she felt a strange emptiness settle over her. The house was immaculate, every corner a testament to their success, but in the stillness, it felt more like a museum than a home. She paused in the living room, staring at the grand piano Ethan had bought for her years ago, back when she'd mentioned wanting to learn. She'd never taken a single lesson. Vanessa shook off the thought and poured herself another glass of wine. She told herself she was happy. She had to be. It was late when Ethan finally pulled into the driveway, the soft glow of the mansion's lights spilling into the night. Nora was fast asleep in her car seat, her tiny form bundled in a blanket. Ethan sat for a moment, watching her breathe, before unbuckling her and cradling her against his chest. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. Vanessa was in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. She looked up as the door clicked shut, her gaze sharpening when she saw him. Then her eyes dropped to the bundle in his arms, and her face froze. "Ethan," she said slowly, rising from the couch. What is that?" He hesitated, adjusting Nora in his arms. "This," he said carefully, "is Nora." Vanessa stared at him, her confusion quickly giving way to disbelief. "What do you mean, this is Nora? What is going on?" "I adopted her," Ethan said, his voice firm but calm. "She needed a home. She needed us." Vanessa's eyes widened, and she took a step back as if the very idea was physically repelling her. "You what? Without even telling me? Without even asking me? Ethan, how could you do this?" "I did this because it felt right," he said, his tone pleading now. "Because I've been trying to talk to you about this for years, and every time you shut me down. Vanessa, I didn't want to lose this chance. She's just a baby. She deserves a family." "And what about me?" Vanessa shot back, her voice rising. "What about what I want? Or does that not matter to you anymore?" "Of course it matters," Ethan said, his frustration boiling over. "But this isn't just about you, Vanessa. Or me. This is about giving this little girl a life, a future. Can't you see that?" Vanessa's expression hardened. "What I see," she said coldly, "is that you made a life-altering decision without me. You didn't even think about how this would affect us. You just went ahead and did what you wanted." "I thought about it," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I thought about it every day. And I knew you'd say no." "Damn right I would have said no," Vanessa snapped. "And you did it anyway." Nora stirred in his arms, letting out a soft cry that cut through the tension. Ethan instinctively rocked her, his gaze never leaving Vanessa. For a moment, she looked at the baby, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. But whatever softness had begun to creep in was quickly smothered. "I can't do this," Vanessa said, grabbing her coat from the back of the chair. "I need to think. I need space." "Vanessa," Ethan called after her, but she was already heading for the door. When it slammed shut, the sound echoed through the empty house. Ethan stood there for a long time, holding Nora against his chest as her cries quieted. The mansion, vast and silent, seemed even emptier than before. But now, as he looked down at the tiny life in his arms, he realized it wasn't just empty, it was waiting to be filled. Vanessa sat in the corner booth of a quiet cafe, nursing a latte that had long gone cold. She stared out the window at the steady drizzle outside, watching raindrops trail down the glass. Her phone buzzed beside her, but she ignored it. She knew it was Ethan. It had been a week since she'd stormed out of the house, and he hadn't stopped calling or texting. She'd read some of his messages, pleas for her to come home, updates about Nora, words filled with a vulnerability she wasn't used to seeing from him. She hadn't responded to any of them. The truth was, Vanessa didn't know what to say. Her anger had burned brightly that first night, fueling her resolve to leave, but it had cooled into something murkier, a mix of guilt, confusion, and a gnawing curiosity she couldn't shake. She hated that he'd made such a monumental decision without her, but she couldn't stop thinking about the baby. Nora. Even now, the image of her tiny face swam into Vanessa's mind, unbidden. It wasn't that Vanessa disliked children. She just never imagined herself as a mother. Growing up, her own childhood had been far from ideal. Her parents' marriage was a battlefield, and she'd spent most of her formative years walking on eggshells, trying to avoid the crossfire. By the time she was old enough to leave, she swore she'd build a life free from chaos, from unpredictability. Motherhood felt like an invitation to everything she'd worked so hard to escape. But was that really all it was? Or was there something deeper she was afraid to face? Vanessa sighed, running her fingers through her hair. She thought about what Charlotte had said that night, about Ethan wanting something real. Was it so wrong for him to want a family? To want more than the glossy perfection they'd cultivated together? She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the life she'd fought so hard to create suddenly felt hollow. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Ethan was learning the hard way just how unprepared he was for fatherhood. Nora's cries pierced through the early morning stillness, dragging him out of bed for the third time that night. He stumbled into the nursery he'd hastily set up in one of the guest rooms, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he scooped her up from the crib. "It's okay, baby girl," he murmured, bouncing her gently in his arms. "I've got you," she quieted after a few moments, nestling against his chest. Ethan sank into the rocking chair, exhaustion etched into his features, but there was a faint smile on his lips. Despite the sleepless nights, the constant diaper changes, and the steep learning curve, he felt more alive than he had in years. Caring for Nora had stripped away the polished veneer of his life and forced him to confront what truly mattered. For the first time, his priorities were clear. His work had taken a back seat, something his board of directors was still adjusting to. He delegated more responsibilities than ever, trusting his team to manage the day-to-day operations. He still attended the critical meetings, but his heart was no longer in them the way it once was. Every moment spent away from Nora felt like a missed opportunity to watch her grow, to be there for the little milestones he knew he'd never get back. One afternoon, Ethan sat with Nora on a blanket spread across the living room floor, surrounded by a sea of soft toys. She babbled happily, reaching for a stuffed elephant he dangled in front of her. He laughed, marveling at how something so simple could feel so monumental. For years, his life had been defined by numbers, profits, losses, market shares. Now, it was defined by this tiny, extraordinary human. As he watched her, he thought about Vanessa. He missed her. He missed the way she used to laugh, the way she used to curl up next to him on the couch, telling him about her latest projects with a spark in her eyes. He missed the person she was before the distance crept in, before their dreams started pulling them in opposite directions. He wanted her to come home. He wanted her to meet Nora, not just as a symbol of the rift between them, but as the beautiful, vibrant child she was. But he couldn't force her. She had to come to that decision on her own. Vanessa finally returned a few days later. It was late in the afternoon, and the house was unusually quiet when she stepped inside. She half expected Ethan to come rushing to greet her, but instead, she followed the faint sound of laughter to the living room. She stopped in the doorway, her breath catching at the sight before her. Ethan was lying on his back on the floor, Nora perched on his chest, giggling as he made silly faces at her. He looked different, softer somehow. Happier. Vanessa had always thought of Ethan as unshakable, a man who thrived on control and precision. But here he was, utterly disarmed by this tiny child. Neither of them noticed her at first. She stood frozen, watching as Nora grabbed at Ethan's nose, earning an exaggerated gasp from him that sent her into another fit of laughter. A strange warmth spread through Vanessa's chest, and for the first time, she felt something other than anger or fear. She felt drawn in. When Ethan finally looked up and saw her, his smile faltered, replaced by a cautious expression. "Vanessa," he said, sitting up carefully with Nora still in his arms. "You're home." "I'm not sure if I am," she said softly, stepping into the room. Her eyes flicked to Nora, who was now staring at her with wide, curious eyes. Vanessa hesitated, her gaze lingering on the baby. "She's beautiful." Ethan nodded, his voice gentle. "She is. And she's been waiting to meet you." Vanessa swallowed hard, her emotions swirling in a way that made her feel unsteady. She sat down on the couch, keeping a careful distance, but her eyes never left Nora. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to know right now," Ethan said, his tone patient. "But I want you to try. For her. For us." Vanessa looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he held Nora like she was the most precious thing in the world. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out her hand. Ethan placed Nora in her arms, and Vanessa froze, overwhelmed by the weight of her tiny body. Nora blinked up at her, her small hand reaching out to touch Vanessa's face. The contact sent a jolt through her, and before she could stop herself, tears welled up in her eyes. She looked at Ethan, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." "I know," he said, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "But we'll figure it out together." In that moment, something shifted. The walls Vanessa had built around herself began to crack, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life that wasn't perfect, but real. A life where love wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. It wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, compromises to make. But as Vanessa held Nora close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, she knew one thing for certain: she wanted to try. In the weeks that followed, the Calloway household began to feel less like a sprawling, empty mansion and more like a home. It was a slow, delicate process, marked by small but significant changes. Vanessa started spending more time with Nora, finding herself captivated by the baby's innocent curiosity. The little girl's giggles, her tiny fingers reaching out to explore the world, seemed to chip away at Vanessa's lingering fears. She still felt unsteady at times, but the moments of doubt were balanced by a growing sense of warmth, of possibility. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, adapted to this new chapter in his life with surprising ease. He marveled at how fatherhood had reshaped his priorities, teaching him to appreciate life's simple joys. Late-night feedings, once an exhausting challenge, became quiet moments of connection. Boardroom victories now paled in comparison to the triumph of getting Nora to take her first steps or hearing her babble new sounds. He realized that his legacy wasn't in the empire he'd built, but in the family he was building now. Vanessa and Ethan still had their disagreements, but their conversations took on a new tone, less combative, more honest. They talked about their fears, their hopes, and the compromises they need to make. Vanessa admitted the deep-seated fears from her childhood that had made her resist the idea of motherhood. Ethan shared how long he'd felt a void in their life together, one he hadn't known how to fill. Through these conversations, they rediscovered the love that had drawn them together in the first place. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real, and it was worth fighting for. One evening, as the three of them sat in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, Vanessa reached for Ethan's hand. Nora was nestled between them on a blanket, babbling softly as she played with a blade of grass. Vanessa glanced at her husband, a small smile playing on her lips. "Maybe you were right," she said quietly. "About what?" Ethan asked, his thumb brushing against her hand. "About wanting more," she replied, her gaze drifting to Nora. "I was so scared of what we might lose, I didn't see what we could gain. She's everything, isn't she?" Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "She is. And so are you." Vanessa leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the moment settle over them like a warm embrace. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't even realized she'd been missing, a sense of belonging. They weren't just two people coexisting in a gilded life anymore. They were a family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a soft twilight, Nora let out a delighted laugh, her tiny hand reaching toward the sky. Vanessa and Ethan laughed with her, their voices mingling with hers in a harmony that felt like the beginning of something new. It wasn't the life Vanessa had imagined, but as she looked at her husband and their daughter, she realized it was so much better than anything she could have dreamed.